I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Michael Nolan. Dr. Nolan is a professor of modern European history at Western Connecticut State University. He obviously specializes in the period that we'll be discussing tonight, and with particular emphasis, I believe, in his career on France and Germany. He's the author of The Inverted Mirror, Mythologizing the Enemy in France and Germany, 1898 through 1914. And it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Nolan tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'm a little overwhelmed. I didn't really expect so many people to be here tonight. I just want to preface this by saying that I realized I was a little bored with the jackets that I had to wear, the choice that I had, so I decided to buy a new jacket. And I realized when I put it on, I also spotted this rather nice purple dress shirt. And I realized when I put them on that it looked a little familiar. Now, I attended a funeral in rural Illinois in January of this year. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in rural Illinois in January, but it's a little bit surreal. And I realized that I looked a little bit like the minister at this funeral. Sure enough, as I was on the way here, I couldn't quite remember where the Historical Society was located, so I stopped over at the Weston Market to ask for directions. And a woman there said, "You look very familiar. Are you English?" And I said, "No, I'm not. Just for the record, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York." Now, if I've had a couple of drinks, I start to sound like I'm from Brooklyn, New York. But my mother was from Seattle, so I inherited her accent. But the woman went on to say that I apparently looked like a choir director at one of the local churches. I'm not sure which one. Suffice to say, I'm not a choir director. At any rate, I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the beginning of World War I. And by necessity, this is something that's going to be very impressionistic. I'm teaching a course on World War I right now to my undergraduates, and I'm spending the entire semester doing World War I. And some of the things that I'm talking about tonight, I actually did this morning in class. But I decided to focus on a particular theme. So rather than trying to give you a kind of dry overview of events in August, early September of 1914, I'm going to focus on just a few episodes, as it were. And one of the things that struck me about this, and it struck me again and again in the research that I've done, is that again and again, just before World War I, and as the war is starting to unfold in those opening weeks, is not so much what is happening out there and what people are experiencing, and it's terrifying, but what's not there, what's missing, what's absent. And very, very often there's a gap of some kind or another. A gap in expectations, a gap in terms of people who might have been there but were not, and might have had a different effect on the outcome. And sometimes a gap in a very literal kind of way. And this is very interesting because this is really about nothing. A gap is literally nothing. Something is missing, right? And you think of people in your life who you might have that had a really important impact, and then they're gone, and that has an impact, and we've all probably experienced that at some point or another, and that's very profound. Now think of that kind of disappearance, however it might be, and then you multiply that by the millions. You begin to realize the impact of this war. 10 million dead. France, Germany, Britain. The United States comes in relatively late, but even so, there were about 3 times as many deaths, American deaths, in World War I as there were in the Vietnam War, which was much, much longer in terms of the time span. So, in thinking about these gaps, I realized that there's some interesting connections. So I'll just mention a few episodes, as it The war, as you probably know, is rooted in, goes a long way back, and we don't have to get into all of the deep causes of it. But of course, the immediate pretext was the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And Franz Ferdinand, as it happens, was someone who was very much against war as an instrument of national policy. One of the things that we have to remember when we consider the situation in Europe 100 years ago is that not just policymakers, not just politicians, generals, and the like, were thinking in terms of warfare, and warfare is a legitimate exercise, something that was very good, in fact, the kind of test of national mettle, if you will. Ordinary people, many ordinary people at least, accepted this idea. So many of the young men that you see going off to war, and we can see some photographs here of them, are deeply imbued with this belief. They've read adventure stories of various kinds. They've read Peter Pan and other stories, and there's this kind of craving for adventure. And when the war does break out, and it breaks out rather suddenly, in late July, early August, there was this period, rather short period of very, very high international tension, and all of a sudden the floodgates are released. People spoke for years about what they called the spirit of 1914. You're enthusiastic, it's going to be a break from the routine. If you're a young man, the opportunities seem boundless. Now, it's not like people thought that no one's going to die, but you're probably familiar with some of the familiar themes. The short war illusion. Many people believed that this wasn't going to last very long, a few months. It'll be over by Christmas, as they said. Kaiser Wilhelm II in Germany actually said, they'll be home before the leaves fall. That has a certain resonance here in New England, certainly. However, the reality is somewhat different. And if there's one book I would recommend to you about the First World War, it's Paul Fussell's The Great War and Modern Memory. And in that book, which he published close to 40 years ago, he investigates this gap between expectations and reality. What people thought the war was going to be like, and the way that the war actually turned out, which was something very, very different, and much more horrible. And it's something that's, I think, it's difficult for us to put ourselves back in that time. We have to remember that this was a time when people were not used to talking about their feelings. So many of the people who came back from the Great War, many of the young men who, in spite of the fact that maybe only 2 or 3 years had passed, they were much older when they got back from having experienced all of that. So this is one example of that kind of gap, as it were. Because Franz Ferdinand is not there in Austria-Hungary, is not there to exert a moderating influence on the court, on the general staff, and others who had this important role in deciding whether Austria-Hungary was going to declare war on Serbia, whether it was going to resort to some kind of punitive action. Therefore, war became much, much more likely. Now here's another example of a gap. And I don't want to overemphasize personalities, but in this particular instance, in this particular moment in time, personalities are very important. And one of the themes that gets passed down, one of the kind of received ideas about the First World War, is that there's an absence of effective leadership. Now, if you enter this room, you'll notice on the right-hand side over there on the wall, there are a number of leaders of World War I who were represented. Now, we can't blame Woodrow Wilson for the outbreak of World War I. He was horrified by this. He was absolutely convinced this was a major crisis in civilization. But we see a number of other people. We see Kaiser Wilhelm down there below, Woodrow Wilson. We see both King George V, who's in the middle on top, and then there's Tsar Nicholas II down below. And if you have trouble telling them apart, that's because they were cousins. They were both grandsons of Queen Victoria, and they were actually very close. They spent a lot of time together growing up, and people would confuse them all the time. But suffice to say that the leadership in 1914 in virtually all the European countries is simply not very capable in terms of dealing with international crises. In earlier times, there's always someone around, a Bismarck, a Disraeli, what have you, who will get people to sit around a table and talk about the crisis at hand. And they'll probably come to some kind of satisfactory conclusion. That doesn't happen in 1914. And here we have another missing element, as it were, a gap that lies at the cause of this war. But there's a particular one that I find rather interesting. And recent literature has delved into this a little bit. And there's a human element to it that I like very much. And I find rather persuasive in terms of if you have to go to war, why shouldn't it be over a woman? Now, the head of the Austro-Hungarian General Staff was Konrad von Hötzendorf. And Konrad von Hötzendorf was a very interesting figure. Some historians, going back quite a ways, Cyril Falls, a British historian of the First World War, thought he was one of the most brilliant military planners of the entire war. He didn't have the resources to put those plans into operation on many occasions. But there was something missing in Conrad's life. Some years before the war, his wife died. He was deeply attached to her. He was completely in love with her. So he was devastated by this. Until he met a young woman less than half his age, named Gina von Reininghaus. Her full name was Virginia, which is very, very unusual in Austria-Hungary in the early 20th century, but she was known as Gina. And Gina, he was totally smitten with her. And it just was purely by accident. He was at a state dinner, and they just happened to be seated together, and apparently he fell in love at first sight. He was totally, totally smitten. And this was a problem. Because, well, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was very Catholic, and particularly the court was strenuously Catholic. Now, I'm a Catholic school survivor, so I have some familiarity with that kind of thing. But suffice to say that this was very discouraging. On top of everything else, she was married and she had 6 children. So the potential is there for a real scandal to her. And he spent much of the rest of his life writing letters to her that he dared not send, because if anyone found them, there might be, the scandal would just be completely over the top. It's a little bit like, say hacking into a cell phone, or obviously, I don't think anyone here would send nude photos of themselves to someone else. I never have, but something very, very similar at that time. Kind of hacking into someone's private communications. He believed that by launching a successful war, he would be able to overcome these obstacles and achieve his heart's desire. As it happens, they got married in 1915. The war didn't turn out so well. It didn't go very well for Austria-Hungary, and I'm sure if you looked at a map recently, you'll notice There's a little country called Austria and a little country called Hungary, but there's no Austro-Hungarian Empire anymore. So Austria-Hungary is one of the countries that bears a lot of the blame, or I should say the leadership, because let's face it, the ordinary people really had no say in whether there was going to be a war or not. But there are other instances of gaps, as it were, of absences that are contributing to this situation. Personal gaps, strategic gaps, what have you. I brought along, by the way, a friend here. Earlier this summer, I was in Narragansett, Rhode Island, and I don't know, maybe you've been out there. There's a guy in Narragansett who sells books and old photographs out of his garage. And I always go and I always pay a visit because he usually has some very, very interesting things. I was going through the bin of photographs and I found him. He is a French soldier who's called up for mobilization in 1914. I don't know who he is. There was no identification on the photograph. It's a very nice photograph. He probably went to a very good photographer to have this taken. It's quite a large photograph. We have to remember that the French army uniforms were rather distinctive in more ways than one. In 1914, he's wearing a blue greatcoat and bright red trousers and a red cap. Not the kind of thing you want to be wearing out on the battlefield in World War I. And that changed very quickly. There are changes in all of the uniforms after 1914. Another thing that's missing in 1914, none of the soldiers, German, French, British, Russian, are wearing steel helmets. It's almost unimaginable. The number of people who were killed by head wounds of various kinds must have been phenomenal. Now, you can't see it, but there's a number on his collar. It's 44. So I decided to do a little research, and it turns out that the 44th Infantry Division in France was one of those that was engaged in what was called the Battle of the Frontiers. And here there's another gap, a gap in terms of strategic imagination, and simply taking into account what happens with the new technologies in machine guns, high explosive artillery, and the like. The Battle of the Frontiers rages for much of the second half of August 1914. On one day, 27,000 French troops were killed, advancing in large masses against artillery, German artillery. 14,000 Germans were killed the same day. And that's just a drop in the bucket. That gives you some idea of what happens during this war. The bloodshed is enormous. Now I know all of us, and I confess, I've been guilty of this as well. We usually tend to think about the French rather differently, and this is patterned by what happened in 1940. Well, the situation is very, very different in 1914. The way I like to put it to my students, and I'll confess, I'm a Francophile. I like France. I find it's a nice country. I love Paris. And yes, they're obnoxious from time to time, but I grew up in Brooklyn. I'm used to that. So I feel right at home when I'm in Paris. Paris is like New York, but much nicer. Much nicer. So I'll just say that 1.5 million Frenchmen were killed in World War I. And this is a country with 39 million people, and it's a terrible, terrible trauma. So, and the depth of it's so hard for us to try to imagine. Again, remember that people were not used to talking about their feelings and talking about their experiences. So a lot of people came home and no one talked, and there's just this deep, deep, resonating sadness, and the effect of that extends across the 20th century. Not just in France. There are 2 million German dead, 2/3 British, a comparable number of Italians, and on and on. And as we've come to realize in recent times, here's another gap, this vast absence, and it extends in many ways across the 20th century. And this is something I'm looking at in my current research, the way the First World War resonates across the previous 100 years or so. So this is another gap, as it were. Something this tremendous. We talk often about the lost generation, which is it's an American phenomenon, a British phenomenon. But there you have it. Now here's another. Sometimes, and particularly when it comes to German expectations of what this war is going to be like, there are a lot of gaps. There are a lot of misjudgments, we might say. And one of those concerns the role of Britain at the beginning of World War I. It was not entirely clear what Britain's attitude would be at the outbreak of war in 1914. Britain had an alliance of sorts with France. It was called the Entente Cordiale, which is a nice way of saying a gentleman's agreement. And this is somewhat typical. The British Foreign Office is very, very skillful at coming up with terminology that doesn't commit them to too much. But when push comes to shove, it becomes very, very clear that if France is attacked by Germany, Britain is going to have to step in. The Entente Cordiale was signed in 1904, so by 1914 it's 10 years old. The respective general staffs have been talking to each other and have made arrangements. And it's a matter of honor in many ways that Britain stick with its commitment. So in 1914, the British Army is minuscule compared to the armies on the continent. The British Army was based entirely on volunteers, recruitment. Britain was the only major European power that did not have conscription. They didn't have a draft. So the British Army consisted of about 400,000 regular troops, many of whom served in the colonies in India and Africa and elsewhere. Now, Britain could also draw on large numbers of colonial troops, and as did France during the course of the war. And that's actually a very, very important factor in this war. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of African, Indian, Southeast Asian, and other troops served in the war as well. But the British government decided it was absolutely necessary to demonstrate right from the beginning their determination to assist France in its hour of need. So they sent the British Expeditionary Force, 100,000 troops. Now that sounds like a lot, but it's not by the standards of 1914. The German army, the French army, both much, much larger. Back in the 1870s, someone once asked Otto von Bismarck, the German chancellor at the time, what would you do in the event of a European war if the British, decide that they're going to line up against Germany and they land an army in the northern part of Germany, say on the Baltic coast or something like that? And Bismarck said, "It's nothing to worry about. We'll call the police." Well, this is very typical, actually. There is a tendency. The Germans are very, very respectful of British naval power. In fact, one of the causes of discord between Britain and Germany was a naval race that is unfolding between 1900 and 1914. And it was pretty clear to everyone, all the contemporaries, that the German Navy, this German Navy that was coming into being, was directed primarily against Great Britain. Now, there's some evidence that the tensions were easing a little bit just before 1914 between Britain and Germany. But suffice to say that the German army did not consider the British army to be a major threat. And this was a major miscalculation, because even though there were only 100,000 troops in the British Expeditionary Force, they were professionals, they were highly trained, and there's a long tradition in the British Army, going back at that time about 200 years or so, in training troops in marksmanship. And I can tell you, I've read a lot of German memoirs of the beginning, from the beginning of World War I. And again, German officers report about coming into contact with the British. We're thrown in, you know, as the Germans are swarming into France through Belgium. Again and again, these German officers are reporting that the casualties of suffering are tremendous. They thought that they were coming up against troops who were armed with machine guns, when in actual fact, all they had were rifles, but they were very, very good shots, and were picking off the Germans like flies. So this was something that really made a big difference, and not least when it came to the big battle. And here I have to point out, we talk about battles in World War I, particularly in the early stages. These aren't battles in the classical sense. These are gigantic slaughters, enormous numbers of troops coming together. You could no longer see the entire battlefield from one place, the way that people, generals and others have done since ancient times. They stand up on a hill and watch everyone killing each other. But when you have armies that are in the hundreds of thousands, the battlefield often extends for dozens, sometimes even hundreds of miles. So it's very, very difficult to tell exactly what's going on. And it's very difficult for the generals, whether it be like Comrade von Hötzendorf in Austria, Helmut von Moltke, the head of the German general staff. They're very often located very, very far behind the lines. And another gap that emerges is the gap between the technology that's available, and often that technology has awesome consequences, in particular the weapons technology. But at other times, the technology lags behind the very ambitious war plans, and particularly the German war plans. The Germans don't have many motorized vehicles, for example. So you probably heard of the Schlieffen Plan at some point or other. This is the big German plan for the invasion of France through Belgium in 1914. It's very ambitious. It plays to the strengths of the German army in 1914. Organizational capacity, the attention to detail, shall we say. I've written in the past about national character and stereotypes and the way that these ideas develop. But there's usually an element of truth to certain stereotypes, certain ideas about national character. And the German general staff is very, very good at planning. And so one of the big debates among historians in recent years has been about the Schlieffen Plan. One historian actually argued there actually wasn't a Schlieffen Plan. They didn't really have a plan in 1914. I don't believe that. The outcome of this has largely been, we should call it the Schlieffen-Moltke Plan, because Moltke made some changes in the plan. Well, this involved moving enormous numbers of troops and trying to coordinate their efforts. And what happens, of course, but just about everything goes wrong. The Belgians weren't supposed to fight back. They did. It's very, very hard to keep to a schedule when people are shooting at you. There's massive sabotage, a cutting of the telegraph lines, blowing up railways, things of this sort. This tends to put the plan behind schedule. One of the big issues that arises very early on in the conflict is, and this is something that resonates for years and years afterward, is the issue of atrocities that are committed by the Germans. The Germans had a very matter-of-fact approach to obstacles, shall we say, in the ways of the plan. So if there were what we would nowadays call insurgents, irregular troops and the like, firing on German columns, they would be dealt with quite ruthlessly. There were a lot of friendly fire incidents. German troops panicked. one of the things that's really striking about all of these troops, German, French, British, almost none of them have really experienced combat. So they're out there, and you can imagine the situation. It's terrifying. People are being killed all around you. You don't know where the fire is coming from. They often assumed it was Belgian civilians, and they would kind of lash out. The destruction of Leuven in Belgium is one of the first major atrocities. For a very, very long time, it was believed that this atrocity propaganda was either grossly exaggerated or very, very, it was just completely fabricated. Well, two British historians, John Horne and Alan Kramer, a few years ago, delved into this. It must have been very, very difficult because you have to peel away layers of propaganda and press reports and the like and try to get to the reality of what happened. And it's pretty clear that German troops killed something like 2,000 Belgian and French civilians. And and here I want to point out, I teach German history, and there's a lot of openness in Germany about there's a lot in German history that's very, very dark and problematic. But the Germans in World War I were not the Germans of World War II. It's a very, very different situation. Certainly the atrocity propaganda exaggerated to an enormous extent what was going on. And the Germans were on the losing side in many ways in the propaganda battle. The British and the French were ahead of them in that regard. And then, of course, what are they thinking of but American public opinion? They're thinking about Woodrow Wilson, they're thinking. And this is very, very interesting. You see a lot of, there's a lot of difference of opinion in the United States about who's in the right and who's in the wrong. And naturally enough, there are German Americans, Irish Americans, and others who have, very, very different opinions, perhaps, from the American establishment toward the outbreak of the war. There are Jewish newspapers, Yiddish newspapers in New York that are publishing poems like Hoch der Kaiser, Long Live the Kaiser. Why? Because the Kaiser and Germany are fighting against Russia, and Russia is perceived as the anti-Semitic state in Europe. It's really rather striking, of course, given in light of later developments. At any rate, the Schlieffen Plan does not quite develop according to expectations. And one result of that is that they have to make adjustments. There are all kinds of expectations that go along with this. One is the invasion of Belgium itself, which pretty much guarantees that Britain is going to enter the war. And the Germans downplay that probability. There was an assumption that it would take quite a long time for the Russians to get their act together and mobilize their troops because of the lack of adequate railways, equipment, training, and so on and so forth. But the Russians launch an invasion of the eastern part of Germany in August of 1914, and the German General Staff panics. Moltke detaches a couple of army corps from the German armies that are advancing on Paris, sends them to the east. Now, it just so happens that the German forces in eastern Prussia, as this area was known, were able to defeat the Russians on their own, so that the troops that were sent from the Western Front arrived after the show was over, so to speak. It didn't work out so well for the Austro-Hungarian army, and this is another element you often don't hear very much about. The Austro-Hungarian army is decimated in 1914. In many ways, it never really recovers from the losses it suffers against the Russians. So, right from the very beginning, we can begin to see a kind of constellation developing, a kind of a situation that is very, very unfavorable toward Germany and Austria-Hungary. But at least to begin with, in late August, early 1914, there is this moment in time when it looks like the Germans have kind of regained the initiative. They're right outside Paris, and it looks like they're about to achieve their objective. I'll just mention, actually, by the way, one of the funny things about being an historian is that you tend to become rather attached to people in the past. We don't live in the past. I like to tell people that, you know, that's kind of nonsensical. But I like the study of the past because it enriches the present. But I do sometimes, and I don't know his name, you know, and I don't know where he's from, but I kind of like him. So I looked up where his division went, and on his collar, you know, it says 44. So I looked up the 44e Division de l'Infanterie, and it turns out that he's sent to the eastern frontier. And there was a big battle right before the Battle of the Marne outside Paris, the Battle of Chipote. I wasn't even really that familiar with it. And a lot of French troops get killed. Did he get killed? I don't know. I hope he didn't. I kind of worry about it. But what can you say? But yes, they were successful. They stopped the German advance in that area. And then the Battle of the Marne takes place. And this is in the, you know, if you've been outside Paris, Paris, you know, is located in the northern part of France, and you know, a lot of the territory, the land around Paris and to the east and north of Paris is farmland. And you know, very, very often it looks like you might be in Wisconsin or someplace like that. There's, you know, either it's flat and there's, you know, a lot of wheat fields and the like, or there's gently rolling countryside. And you know, it looks very nice, particularly in the summertime. Probably not so nice, again, if it's by the way, it's August, it's hot. German soldiers, French soldiers are marching, getting shot at. So it's not very pleasant. And particularly at the Battle of the Marne, because what we have here is a gigantic mutual slaughter. By this point, British and French troops have pulled back from the border, particularly the Belgian border, in the face of the advancing German units. In spite of German expectations, British and French withdrawal is very orderly. There's no rout at all. One of the counterfactuals we sometimes imagine, what would have happened had the Germans won the Battle of the Marne? I'm not even sure it was possible to win the Battle of the Marne, or if it probably would have been a draw if it hadn't turned out the way it did. And the British and the French could simply have withdrawn further into France. The French government had already switched to Bordeaux in the southwest of France. So they had already left Paris. So they probably would have just kept fighting. And the plan just didn't take that kind of thing into account. So what we have is a situation where the Germans are facing the combined British and French forces outside of Paris. And the battle rages, as it happens, between September 5th and September 12th of 1914. So it's a week. That tells you something about battles in World War I. Again, gigantic mutual slaughters. In the course of this battle, in the fog of war, as it were, you know, communications break down. It's very hard to tell on either side what's going on. At some point or another, the British and the French forces realize a gap, there it is again, has opened up between the 1st and 2nd German armies on the far right flank, the closest area to Paris. One thing you might know about the Battle of the Marne is that there's this kind of famous image that emerges of the reinforcements being brought out from Paris in the taxi cabs and the street, you know, the buses and whatever vehicles they could lay their hands on. They brought out reinforcements. And once they discover this gap, they start moving into it. And it looks for a time like the entire German right wing might be completely outflanked and cut off. And this would be a disaster. This would completely transform the situation. Now here's another instance of a lack of courage, a lack of responsibility, one might say. The famous case of passing the buck. It's another, in German military history, this is very, very famous, but you don't hear about it much very much here. Moltke, who is now on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He's 150, 200 miles or so behind the lines, getting all of these reports coming in, can't quite tell what's going on. So he decides to dispatch a junior officer, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hensch. You probably never heard of it. Most people have. Hensch is the head of the intelligence section on the German general staff. And Moltke gives him full powers to head to the front, find out what's going on, and issue the appropriate orders. He's a lieutenant colonel, by the way, remember that. But any order that he gives has to be followed. He goes, he analyzes the situation, he talks to the commanders of the respective armies, and comes to the conclusion that the Germans have to withdraw or they're going to face a catastrophic defeat. For years afterwards, there are recriminations back and forth about this. You know, were the Germans really in that kind of danger outside of Paris? And this is another legacy of the war that's very, very unfortunate, which is that, and here I have to say, we can never talk about the Germans think this, and the French think that, and the British think the other. It's usually much more nuanced, and there are a lot of differences of opinion. But suffice to say that there's a substantial segment of German opinion after World War I that becomes convinced that Germany didn't really lose the war. It was about other things. There were people at home who were disloyal. It was about the civilian politicians and the like. That's nonsense, and it's not just in 1914, subsequently as well. The military leadership in Germany failed to bring about either an outright victory or a negotiated settlement. And that too, that's one of the great tragedies of this war. Again and again, there were attempts of one kind or another to reach out to try to negotiate an end to the war. But of course, what happens? Well, there are those who say, so many have died already. So many dead. How can we settle for anything less than absolute victory? And it goes on and on and on until finally one side simply collapses. And that's what happens ultimately in 1918. At any rate, as a result of the Battle of the Marne, German troops retreated, pulled back. The French and the British are saying, hooray! À Berlin, to Berlin. We're going to Berlin now. And they're expecting they're going to cross the German frontier. And all of a sudden, they come up against a line of prepared fortifications along the valley of the Aisne River, some ways to the north of Paris. And the Germans had the advantage in this regard. They were able to pick out the best, most defensible positions. And they realized at this point that they were in it for the long haul. So they were prepared to sit tight. The British and the French didn't have that perspective. They thought that this was just a temporary stop, a temporary obstacle, so to speak. And of course, what happens, but they spend most of the next 4 years locked into a stalemate on both sides. There is another episode here that, because the two armies are coming together, there's an attempt to try, on each side, to try to outflank the other side. And this is an episode that, in the fall of 1914. It's called the Race to the Sea. It's not a race to the sea. It's simply a gigantic slugfest, basically, as each army tries to outflank the other, until finally you have a system of trenches extending all the way from the Swiss frontier to the English Channel, 450 miles. And as that system of trenches develops, it's not just straight lines of trenches. There are thousands of miles of trenches. There are support trenches. There are communication trenches. It's one of the things about the First World War that I find just amazing is the sheer amount of labor that goes into building thousands of miles of trenches. It is one of the outstanding works of engineering of the 20th century. And what is it intended for? But to kill as many people as possible. Anyway, I see that I'm at the end of my time, so I hope you found that interesting. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Yes?
I was just wondering if you had any thoughts regarding anything that any of the major powers in Europe could have done to prevent World War I from breaking out?
That's a good question. And, you know, it's funny, you know, 1914 was not a year when people really expected a major international crisis. 1912, 1913 had actually been a period where there were a number of major tensions among the great powers. And the spring of 1913, a lot of people expected there was going to be an outbreak of war. But eventually cooler heads prevailed. This is something I think that we tend to forget when we look at 1914. Hindsight sometimes isn't 20/20. Because, you know, a lot of the actors assumed that the war, you know, maybe there was not going to be a war. We'll just you know, do a little saber rattling, as they used to call it in those days. Or, you know, if there's going to be a war, it will be a limited war, a regional war. It won't draw in all the great powers. Or, you know, there's the short war illusion, the idea that even if there is a general war, it's not going to last very long. Someone's going to have a decisive victory. All of these are possible scenarios. But what happened was the worst case scenario, the one that, you know, very few people actually anticipated in its full awfulness.
In days of Frankens, the peace to end all peace, one of the things that made a deep impression on me was how many, quote, experts disagreed with each other.
Yes.
But everyone believed them, and none of them really knew anything. And how would you relate that to all the pundits today?
Ditto.
Yeah, that is a sore point, isn't it? Yes, there are a lot of people. I think particularly in American society, we have a tendency to distrust credentials, but credentials do mean something. Not everything, believe me, and there are plenty of people who are academics who don't know what they're talking about either. But if someone calls himself an expert, look into that. You know, try to figure out exactly what that is based on. And certainly, you know, I have journalists in the family, so I have to be careful about this. But you know, a degree in journalism, you know, doesn't necessarily qualify you for, you know, pronouncing about all kinds of areas of expertise. Yeah.
Well, in that same book, Peace to End All Peace, my take on his view of bringing the Ottoman Empire into it was that the Brits really pushed the Ottomans into the other side in order to, because they really coveted the Mideast. Would you subscribe to that?
Yeah, well, there is something to that, and it's very interesting. And he goes into Churchill's involvement in all of this. With in 1911 already, the British had effectively established Kuwait as a separate emirate under their protection. But it's not just the British. You often hear about the Sykes-Picot Agreement during the war, which is the Franco-British agreement. But in actual fact, there was a Russian signatory to that as well, the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sazonov. And Sazonov and the Russians had very wide-ranging ambitions in the Ottoman Empire, not least the actual center of the Ottoman Empire, Constantinople, as they called it in those days, and the Straits. So it's really a Franco-British-Russian agreement. So, and particularly nowadays, I think that this is a real sore point in many places of the Middle East, the role of Britain in the Middle East in World War I and after. It was actually, I was at an open house at my daughter's school yesterday, and there was a teacher in human geography who brought up an interesting point. It was something I completely overlooked. But apparently when the forces of ISIS were advancing, or ISIL, or whatever you want to call them, were advancing from Syria into Iraq earlier in this summer, they were on Twitter. They actually had a hashtag, which was Sykes-Picot over. And that's very, very interesting. And people in the Middle East know this history. They know about the long roots of this situation in the Middle East. And I think a lot of us, are just not familiar with that. Other questions?
One more.
Yes.
Would you comment on maybe my impression that this was a war that was a change from normal European wars, which were short, a punch-up, maybe some land exchange or some tribute paid, and everybody went home and was happy. To the final time where this is time where it's full conflagration,
Yep.
and it was a war that we were going to just destroy the opposition. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, and there are a number of different elements to this, which there's a kind of mythology of Europe from the downfall of Napoleon to 1914, almost exactly 100 years, where Europe is relatively peaceful. If there are wars, the Crimean War, Franco-Prussian War, what have you, they're relatively short. They don't involve all the great powers, so there's not a general continental European war. Well, the reality is that Europe in many ways is turning that violence outward toward other parts of the world, toward Africa, India, China. China is key to understanding late 19th, early 20th century Europe and global affairs generally. And in many ways, what happens in World War I, you're bringing back the methods of colonial warfare, Maxim guns, artillery and the like, high explosives. You're bringing them back to Europe and you're using them against each other. So it's
Instead of wars of conquest, yeah.
Wars of conquest. Some have argued the first major genocide of the 20th century is the measures that the Germans take against the Herero Uprising in Southwest Africa. It was now Namibia in 1907. There's a major uprising, and thousands of the Herero are killed in very deliberate fashion. But I'm not singling out the Germans here. This kind of thing happens throughout the colonial territories.
And the Russo-Japanese War, back in
Sure.
1904, something like
Yes.
that.
Kind of dress rehearsal.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.